Hi, this is Andrew Versa, and today we're going to take a deep dive into our new flagship keyboard library, Altera Keys. Altera Keys features 20 unique keyboard instruments, which you can see on the main UI here. These are all inspired by real analog, acoustic, and digital keyboards. For example, we have emulations of the Rhodes, Wurlitzer, Clavinet, DX7, JP800, but these aren't just the same exact electric pianos that you've heard over and over again in hundreds of other sample libraries. Each one of these has been recreated from scratch using synthesis and physical modeling to create something that's truly new and unique. This really breathes new life into these instruments because all of these recordings are completely unique. And naturally, they've been deeply multi-sampled. Now, right off the bat, the first thing you'll notice is that there are 5 layers. Because we created these sound sources from scratch, we're able to break out the different components and let you choose which ones you want to use independently. So let's start by going into a basic patch. We'll load up the Rose Mark I ballad. This is a very simple sound, but let's check it out layer by layer. If we turn off the tines and the releases, and we turn up the keys layer, you'll just hear the basic keyboard sound source. And when I let go of the keys, or if I let go of the sustain pedal, we don't hear any kind of release. So now let's enable the tines layer and play with this volume a little bit. Now we hear a little bit of a glassy attack. This is the glassy mellow sound source. We can turn this up. Or we can select a different tine sound source, which will put a totally different attack on the sample. Sines is a very balanced one. Or we could do something metallic. Or more inharmonic. And again, you can adjust this balance however you want. So if you want less key noise or more, you can simply dial that in, and all of that is automatable. This Car+1 is based on a physically modeled string, so it's kind of adding extra string transient. Let's try using additive. And now let's enable the release noises and play with the volume here. And if that's too subtle, we can turn them up. So even with these things alone, you can get a ton of tonal possibilities. Let's check out another sound. For example, the Diamond Rhodes, which is a digital keyboard. And we can play with the tines and releases here as well. Because this is a different keys sound source, the way the tines blend in with it is going to be very different than the Rhodes. For example, Squarish here has a more low frequency, punchy attack to it. And you can see how useful this could be when you're trying to fit a keyboard into a mix. Like the Diamond Rhodes has a lot of sort of glassiness to it. So if you add the squarish or punchy tines layer, then that's going to help fill in the low range more. Whereas if we use something like sines or glassy mellow, that's going to emphasize the high end even more. And if we turn off the tines and releases, and this is really just scratching the surface. There's so much you can do, but I want to move on to some of the other layers now. Let's pull up something like the Pianet Z. This is a classic sound. Now, you notice that tremolo effect, we can increase that depth or turn it off completely. So now let's talk about some of the other layers. Let's say we like the tines and the release noises. and we want to add some more body and sustain to it, we can enable the pad layer, which does exactly what it sounds like. And of course, just like the other layers, there's different tones to choose from. Some of these are more warm and analog sounding, others are more digital and bright. And now you can see where the fun really starts, because now we can swap the layer that we're using. For example, let's go with a Rhodes sound like the Mark II suitcase. And we can play around with all of these layers together. And so finally, let's introduce the Shimmer layer. The Shimmer is a super complex long tail reverb that we created for each individual key's sound source. So I'm just going to play a simple C major chord here. The shimmers are just incredibly beautiful, and we have a unique shimmer for each individual sound source. So let's check out something like the DX7 Mellow. So now let's try adjusting the layer balance, and maybe we want to have just a little bit of subtle shimmer and pad. We want something that's a bit more glassy and bright in the high end. And if the hundreds of built-in presets aren't enough, and by the way, I have 2 other videos where I go through many of these, you can simply go to the dice icon in the bottom right. We'll click the drop down and select Layer Sources and Layer Mix. So this is just going to randomize what sound sources are selected and their volumes. And we can just hit random and see what happens. But now let's check out the sound page, because here's where we can dig in more to the performance elements of each patch. I'm going to go ahead and select the Rhodes Mark II suitcase. Now we have some fairly straightforward controls for the envelope of the keys, the attack, decay, sustain, and release. I won't spend much time on it here, but for example, let's say you want more of a release tail on each note. I can play staccato, and there's more fade out time. This is probably more useful for something like a bell style sound like this. Let's go back to the Mark II. So besides the envelope, you can control the sensitivity of velocity to volume and brightness. By default, it's set so that you can play a pretty wide range of dynamics. If you want to emphasize that even more, we can set that to 100%. So if I play soft, we hear almost nothing, and I have to really play loudly in order to hear a brighter and louder sound. It gives you more range. The velocity curve, on the other hand, actually modifies the incoming velocity. So let's say you have a very heavy action MIDI keyboard and you have to really put a lot of force into it in order to get louder notes. What you can do is curve all your velocities up like this, so you don't have to play as hard. Or the opposite, if you have a very sensitive keyboard and you want everything to take a little bit more force, you can just curve it down. This preamp toggle enables a true-to-life analog emulation of a real Rhodes preamp. You can select either 70s or 80s style, each of which has a subtly different effect on both the tone EQ, and just check out how it can add more color to the sound. So I'm going to play a nice wide C chord, and now I'm going to increase the bass. It's really more than a simple EQ. It's actually adding a lot more weight. And then there's the treble, of course. And this can apply to any sound source, and it can make a big difference on each. For example, if I pull up one of the Clavinet style sounds, let's see what happens when I turn off that preamp. It's a fantastic preamp emulation. I highly recommend leaving that on. Down here, we can sculpt the sound of the tines. So let's see an example of that. We'll pull up the electro piano sound, which is one of the more warm sounding analog sounds we have. And I'm going to turn off the tremolo just so we can hear it as clean as possible. And now let's pull up one of the tines. How about the squarish here? And I'm going to emphasize this just so you can hear what it's doing. And compare that to something like this. Now, let's say we're using metal in harmonics, and of course we have it turned up pretty loud. But we don't like the high-end element as much. We can just apply a high cut. Or we can go to the punchy, which has a lot of low end. And we can cut some of that out with a gentle filter. The attack and sustain here aren't actually envelopes. This is a transient designer. So let's pull up the true Rhodes. Now this is the actual mechanical noise from a real Rhodes piano. And you can hear, again, even though I have these tines turned up, there's still a lot of attack to it. So we can just turn down the attack emphasis. Or we can emphasize the transient even further. Let's say we like that, we can just reduce the volume over all of that layer. The Shimmer Layer has its own low cut and high cut, as well as a tail. But you can hear that it sort of cuts out pretty quickly when I lift up the note, so we can just increase the reverb tail time. And we can even take out some of those very high-end sparkles. And then the pad pretty much acts just like the keys, but it can be kind of interesting because, for example, let's pull up this Warm Keys basic layer. Let's turn off the tremolo. Now let's say we add the pad sound, and we could do one of the more digital sounding pads. But we might decide that this particular pad, we don't actually want it to sustain the whole time. And instead, we can just layer in some of the attack from the pad. We would do this by decreasing the sustain time to 0 of the pad, and then we can just use a little bit of decay. So basically, this pad sound will only last about 580 milliseconds. Here's what it sounds like without the pad. and width. Or we could do the opposite. We could have the pad fade in over a long period while we're holding the note. And in fact, this is how we did some of the really beautiful evolving presets. We did the same thing with the shimmer attack. So we could bring in, for example, the shimmer and the pad over about the same period of time. That's just one of the many sound design possibilities with this instrument. You can tell by the streamlined nature of the interface that this is really an instrument meant for performance. We wanted to make it easy to get a new sound and to adjust your current sound without diving into a lot of submenus and tabs and learning a complex new interface. Oh, and by the way, with regards to the shimmer and keys, even though we have a unique shimmer for each key sound source, you can actually disconnect that link. So when we play the sound, right now we're hearing the ZD800 warm keys, but we could just as easily use the Wurlitzer shimmer instead. Which has a different frequency profile. Just sort of a bonus feature of having this as its own unique layer. Now using the basic little fatty clav as our base, let's check out the final page, the mixer and effects. If you've used some of our libraries with console, you'll get the general idea here, but we have over 40 unique effects. You can use any of these effects in any order, and you've got 8 inserts to do it with. Let's say we want to add a deep phaser. We can just put in Phasis, which is the latest version. We could add a separate reverb, like a plate, for example. Let's disconnect dry and wet. We could add in a tape emulation, which is really nice and warm sounding. Now it's worth noting that these are all insert effects that take place after all layers are combined. So here I have the tape cranked up, and you can hear it's affecting all layers. But if you don't want that, you can actually bypass one layer by going to the output menu at the top, and you can send it master no effects. So let's say I don't want the pads and shimmer to do that. Now those are no longer affected. You can also send them out to different outputs in your host. How you do this is going to depend on what host you're using, and there are guides available on the Native Instruments website, but you'll be able to route to different stereo outputs if that's how you have Kontakt configured. So that is the overview of Altera Keys. I've played with a lot of sounds here. I'm going to play with a few more just so you can hear them, and then we'll wrap up. Here we're listening to the pads category. So whether you're a worship musician, whether you're playing live or in the studio, if you're doing soundtrack composition or funk or R&B, blues, there is something in Altera for everyone. We are so proud of this library and we had so much fun making it. It's available as of June 4th, 2024 for Contact Player 7, which is the free version, so there is no other purchase required to use the instrument. And be sure to check your customer portal on the Impact Soundworks website to see if you have any cross grades. This has been Andrew Versa, and I will see you next time.